In the 1980s, my leisure time was sort of hanging about around friends' house. During the 80s, we used to have a lot of our amusement. We used to have sound system. So during the day, we used to go and test music. What we used to call test, we used to just play music, hear what it used to sound like, listen to our speaker box, because we used to do things like sound clash, go and play against other sound systems. Apart from that, during the late 80s, I was working. During the 80s, a lot of jobs for black people were, during my time, they was encouraged to go into youth work, social kind of work, and that was the kind of stuff we was doing. There was quite a lot of restriction to what you can and can't do during that time, during the 80s.
What sort of stuff? What sort of restrictions?
We had a lot of discrimination during those times when you went for jobs. A lot of times you knew you weren't going to get them, so a lot of black people went for jobs like in factories, like being a mechanic at a guy's place underneath the flyover, things like that, which wasn't jobs that black people was aspiring to when they was at school, basically. But those were the only things that they had. And then to cap things off, when they got criminal records, it sort of restricted what jobs they could go for as well.
Okay. Where did you live? And why did you choose to live there?
Okay, I was brought up in West London, an area called Ladbroke Grove, or known as Notting Hill, where the carnival is every year. That's where I grew up. That's where my parents ended up living, so I didn't have a choice to where I had to live. But one thing which I can say, I have no regrets about living in West London. It was a vibrant area at the time. It was, apart from Brixton, you had places like Brixton, Hackney, and Notting Hill, which was predominantly a black area. So for me, growing up in that area, I felt very comfortable. Yeah, I just liked the area. It was just a nice area. I don't have no regrets about living there.
Okay.
And what was your house like?
My house, we lived in a council flat. I grew up in a council estate. And for me, I was lucky enough that my council estate was a small council estate, where a lot of my friends who grew up, what we used to call back in the days, we used to call them concrete jungle. And basically what it is it's like a lot of flats put together. So an example of that would be the Aylesbury estate, would be the equivalent to that, to what I'm talking about. But that's where a lot of my friends lived. And the housing was pretty bad. We had a lot of derelict land around those days as well, where nothing was being built, and during those days we could go and we could play. There was no such thing during those days as health and safety as we know it today. For example, when we used to go to Adventure Playground, we used to break our arms, which was natural, break your leg, but it was nothing that we used to go and sue. We didn't even know nothing about suing in those days, about suing the council for damages. So a lot of stuff we used to do was what I'd call high risk, but enjoyable.
Okay. What job did you have, and was it easy to find one?
My first job, it's a funny story to this one. My first job, I went with a friend for him to get a job, and I ended up getting the job instead of him. But my first job was making contact lenses. That was my first ever job. First ever paid job, I should say, was making contact lenses. Again, that was in a factory. From that, I left there and I went to work for Dixon's, which is now Curry's. But back in the days, it used to be called Dixon's. And I went to work from there, and from there, I went into youth work. And one of the reasons why I went into youth work was basically there was a lot of black kids hanging about with nothing to do, similar to today, with nothing to do. And one of the youth workers saw me as a guy that they felt that I had a lot of leadership skills and young people would listen to me. And that's how I got involved in youth work, basically.
Okay.
So, yes.
What was the climate like? Was it easy to get a job? Was it difficult?
It was difficult. As a young black man, it was very difficult. We did aspire to find bigger jobs, but it was just difficult for us to get those jobs, and there was a lot of discrimination with getting jobs. Basically, you would go for a job, a white guy would go for a job, and they would tell you they ain't got no job, but then the white guy would go for the job and they tell them they've got a job. So those are the kind of things that we encountered. So what that impacted on us was that a lot of black guys got frustrated, and for me that was kind of it was evident in the riots that was happening in the 80's. That was because a lot of black kids didn't have nothing to do, there was nothing for them to do, and they just felt useless, worthless. So when things like the Cherry Gross, when she died, it was like, wow, yes, that's our excuse, that's our reasoning to sort of make a stand for things, to make a stand for ourselves. Encompassed with that, during our time, we had a thing which is known as sus. And sus is basically, police could stop you at any time on the street and search you and arrest you. And a lot of black young men used to get stopped for that. And it was even harder for the Rastafarians because they used to be targeted more than anybody else, because obviously they associate them with cannabis, and the police saw them as an easy picking to arrest, because they would say, oh, if you stop a Rasta man, you know he's going to have cannabis on him, so we're going to nick him and take him to the police station. And a lot of those things sort of helped the riot, how the rioting started in the 80's, because it was just frustration, and we just said we just had enough, and we just went on a riot, and we just smashed stores, was throwing things at the police, smashing up police cars, and then the carnival happened as well, and we had a few riots in the carnival, and that again was because police was manhandling young black men during that time. So that's why we had the riots. And to be honest with you, looking back on it now, I thought it was something good, because after the riots, they started to pump money into a lot of workshops or into a lot of black establishments to employ young black men and women those days.
Any more?
He basically.
Yeah, no, ask anyway.
What was your experience of the 1890 riot?
The riots, my experience was that it was something that was needed. But my only disappointment with the rioting was that people tend to riot where they live. And so they ended up mashing up their own community. That was my only negative I had about the rioting. The rioting was needed, but I felt that they would have been better off if they'd gone to somewhere like Oxford Street, Hampstead, and had the rioting, because I think would have had a better and bigger impact than destroying their own neighbourhood. And to be honest with you, I feel that politicians was quite happy with us having the riot on our own doorsteps, because it was our own community we was destroying. So yeah.
Do you have any personal stories or personal memories from the riots?
I do, but I don't want to say.
Well, what about anything that you witnessed that wasn't personal to you?
Yes, I witnessed a lot of, during that time I witnessed a lot of discrimination, in the sense of a lot of black guys were targeting white guys. Okay, I'll give you an experience that I experienced. I'm sure it was the 80's, they had this program called Roots. And I remember I used to go to a club called Cryptic One Club, which was in Bayswater. And we used to go there and we used to watch Roots. And what used to happen, it used to get us upset. Because we used to see how they used to treat us in slavery and stuff like that. And what a lot of the guys would want to do, as soon as they came out the club, they'd want to take it out on a white guy. So they would see a white guy and they'd want to just beat him up. The poor white guy didn't know what it was all about, but all he knew, he was just getting a beating. But that was because there was a lot of frustration about watching Alex Haley's Roots and the impact it had on us. So that's one of my experience.
Okay. What team do you support?
That's a good question.
What team do I support? I support Tottenham.
Oh, you're dead. Thank you.